The sky over northern Maine had turned the color of bruised slate by 2 in the afternoon. Vivian Vance adjusted her grip on the hand-stitched leather steering wheel of her obsidian black Porsche Cayenne, her mind entirely consumed by the upcoming emergency board meeting of Vance Global Enterprises. Her father, Arthur Vance, had been dead for exactly 1 year, leaving her at the helm of a multi-billion-dollar shipping and infrastructure empire. She was driving toward a remote, decommissioned valley shipyard he had stubbornly refused to liquidate before his passing. It was supposed to be a routine inspection. Then, the steering column froze. There was no warning light, no shuddering vibration. The wheel simply locked hard to the right, as if welded in place, and the brake pedal sank uselessly to the floorboard under her designer heel. The heavy luxury SUV veered violently off the asphalt, tearing through loose gravel before slamming broadside into a parked, weathered, midnight blue Chevrolet pickup truck resting on the shoulder of the logging road. The impact was deafening, a sickening crunch of premium German engineering meeting vintage American steel. Airbags deployed with a white puff of chemical dust. Trembling but uninjured, Vivian pushed her way out of the smoking vehicle. Her tailored gray blazer was covered in powder, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was a woman used to absolute control, feared by senior executives and ruthless in boardrooms, but the sudden brush with mortality left her hands shaking. A man stepped out from the small timber frame building across the road. He wore a faded canvas work jacket, heavy leather boots, dusted with fine wood shavings, and dark jeans. He didn't run. He walked with a measured, deliberate stride that suggested nothing in this world could easily startle him. He had a strong, angular jawline, a shadow of stubble, and eyes the color of a winter sea, calm, deep, and entirely unreadable. "You need to move this vehicle immediately," Vivian demanded, her voice sharp with adrenaline as she stepped toward him. She pulled her platinum corporate card from her pocket, her reflex to command and compensate overriding her shock. "My steering failed. Write down your name and your insurance details. I will have my assistant wire a replacement value for this truck to your account by dusk. But right now, I need a vehicle to get to the regional airport in Portland." Garrett Sterling did not look at the corporate card. He didn't even look at her. He walked past her to the crumpled nose of his truck, running a large, calloused hand over the dented steel quarter panel. When he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant rumble that carried an unmistakable weight. "The frame is twisted," Garrett said evenly, his tone completely devoid of the panic or anger Vivian expected, "and you won't be making it to Portland by dusk. There isn't a rental agency within 40 miles, and the fog is rolling off the ridge. Perhaps you didn't hear me," Vivian said, her posture stiffening as her cold, defensive corporate persona took over. "I am Vivian Vance. The damage to your property is irrelevant. Name your price for whatever vehicle you have in that barn, and let me go. I don't have time for small-town delays." Before Garrett could answer, the door to the timber building creaked open. A little girl, no older than 6, stepped onto the porch. She wore a bright yellow raincoat that was slightly too large for her, her dark curls bouncing as she cradled a small, handmade wooden birdhouse against her chest. She took one look at the smoking luxury vehicle, her wide brown eyes filling with sudden anxiety, and ran straight toward Garrett, burying her face into the side of his leg. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is the loud car okay?" The transformation in the man was instantaneous. The quiet, guarded barrier he held against Vivian vanished. Garrett knelt in the gravel, completely ignoring the mud, staining his work pants, and wrapped his powerful arms around the little girl. He brought his hand up to gently stroke her hair, his face softening with an immense, protective warmth that caught Vivian entirely off guard. "Everything is fine, Clara," Garrett murmured, his voice incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to his rugged appearance. "The lady just had a rough stop. Go back inside and tell Pauline to put the kettle on. We have a guest who's going to be waiting on a tow truck." Clara peeked out from behind her father's shoulder, looking at Vivian with a pure, unfiltered curiosity that made the powerful CEO feel strangely exposed. The child nodded softly, trusting her father completely, and scurried back into the building. Garrett stood back up, his expression returning to that impenetrable, steady calm. He reached into his jacket pocket to retrieve a thick, heavy cream envelope that had been tucked away near his chest. As he pulled it out, Vivian's breath caught in her throat. The paper was aged, slightly creased at the corners, but across the front was a distinctive, authoritative, cursive script written in dark blue ink. It was a handwriting she had analyzed 1,000 times on corporate charters, a handwriting she would recognize anywhere. It was her father's. Written on the envelope were 5 words. For Vivian, when it falls. Vivian took a step forward, her cold demeanor fracturing completely as a chill raced down her spine. Where did you get that? That's my father's writing. Who are you? Garrett slid the envelope back into his canvas jacket, his gaze holding hers with a quiet, unyielding strength. The tow truck will be an hour. I suggest you come inside out of the cold, Miss Vance. We have a lot to discuss. The interior of the building was a vast, high-ceilinged workshop that smelled heavily of cured walnut, beeswax, and dry wood smoke. A massive cast-iron stove crackled in the far corner, throwing a deep, amber warmth across the open floor. This was no ordinary small-town carpentry shop. As Vivian stepped inside, her eyes immediately locked onto the projects, resting on the heavy timber workbenches. To her left stood a breathtaking 12-foot conference table made of rare, book-matched black walnut, its edges sanded to a flawless, liquid-smooth finish. Hanging on a clipboard by the door was a shipping ledger listing delivery addresses that made her breath hitch. A boutique hotel in Manhattan, a historic estate in Martha's Vineyard, and a private gallery in San Francisco. This man was not struggling for pennies in the woods. He was an elite artisan who chose absolute isolation over the corporate spotlight. An elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun stepped out from a small kitchen area in the back. She wore a handmade knitted shawl and carried a steaming ceramic teapot. She looked at Vivian's powder-dusted blazer, then at Garrett, exchanging a silent, knowing look that required no words at all. "Pauline, this is Vivian Vance," Garrett said, hung up his heavy canvas jacket on a wooden peg by the door. He did not touch the cream envelope, leaving it safely secured in the inner pocket. Her vehicle had a mechanical failure on the Ridge Road. "She'll be waiting here until the flatbed arrives from Weymouth Hollow." Pauline gave a soft, empathetic nod. "Sit down by the fire, child. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'll pour you some hot chamomile tea. The wind is picking up outside." Vivian remained standing, her body rigid, her defensive walls firmly locked in place. She pulled her dead smartphone from her pocket, staring at the black screen in frustration. "My phone lost signal 3 miles back. I need a landline. I have a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure merger finalizing in Boston on Monday morning, and my executive vice president is waiting for my confirmation report." "The storm took the landline wires down last Tuesday," Garrett replied calmly, walking over to his workbench. He picked up a hand plane and began shaving a long, thin ribbon of white oak from a chair leg. The steady, rhythmic shh, shh of the blade against the wood was the only sound in the cavernous room. "The only signal you'll get is at the top of the fire tower 3 miles north, and you aren't walking up there in those shoes." Vivian took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady the persistent tremor in her fingers. She marched directly up to Garrett's workbench, her presence commanding, her eyes flashing with a cold, desperate authority. "Let's drop the small-town hospitality, Mr. Sterling. You have an envelope with my father's personal handwriting on it. Arthur Vance has been dead for 12 months. He died of sudden cardiac arrest in his private study, and his estate was thoroughly settled by the highest-paid probate attorneys in New England. How do you have a letter addressed to me, and why are you hiding it in a logging valley?" Garrett stopped his hand tool. He did not look up immediately. He set the plane down with extreme precision, blew a stray wood shaving off the oak surface, and finally raised his winter sea eyes to meet hers. The sheer steadiness of his gaze made Vivian want to take a step back. "I'm not hiding anything, Miss Vance," Garrett said, his voice entirely level. "Your father came to me exactly 1 week before his heart failed. He sat in that very rocking chair by the stove. He didn't come to me as a billionaire tycoon. He came to me as a terrified father who knew the clock was ticking down to zero." "Terrified of what?" Vivian demanded, her voice tight. "My father wasn't afraid of anything. He built Vance Global from a single salvage crane into a global logistics empire. He was afraid of the people he allowed into his inner circle," Garrett said quietly, "and he was afraid of what those people would do to you once he was no longer around to shield you." Before Vivian could press further, Clara padded out from the back bedroom. She had taken off her yellow raincoat, revealing a small denim overalls outfit. In her tiny hands, she held a freshly baked sugar cookie resting on a paper napkin. She walked slowly, her eyes fixed entirely on Vivian, navigating the wood shavings on the floor with careful steps. She stopped right in front of the cold, intimidating CEO and extended her hands, offering the cookie. It's still warm, Clara whispered, her voice a soft, comforting melody. When I get scared of thunder, Daddy gives me a warm cookie and it makes the bad noise go away. You look like the bad noise is loud right now. Vivian froze. She had spent her entire adult life navigating cutthroat boardrooms, dodging hostile takeovers, and managing hundreds of millions of dollars, but she had absolutely no blueprint for dealing with the pure, unvarnished empathy of a child. She looked down at the cookie, then at Clara's hopeful face. Slowly, with an awkwardness that revealed just how long it had been since she experienced genuine human warmth, Vivian reached down and took the napkin. "Thank you, Clara," Vivian murmured, her voice losing its razor-sharp edge for the first time since the crash. Clara tilted her head, inspecting her. "What's your name, lady?" Vivian hesitated. The name Vivian Vance felt heavy, tied to cold boardrooms and betrayal. In front of this innocent child, she didn't want to be the feared CEO. "My middle name is Sloane," she whispered softly. Clara grinned, her dark curls bouncing. "Sloane. I like that." Garrett watched the interaction from the shadows of his workbench, a subtle, unreadable shift occurring in his expression. The rigid hardness in his jaw relaxed just a fraction as he saw the high-powered executive soften for his daughter. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the workshop rattled violently as a gust of wind swept through the valley. Outside, the headlights of a heavy flatbed tow truck cut through the thick, gray fog, its yellow-amber warning lights rotating slowly across the timber walls. Vivian snapped back into her corporate reality, her posture instantly hardening once more. "That's my ride out of here. I'm going to ask you one last time, Mr. Sterling. Give me the envelope. It belongs to the Vance estate." Garrett walked over to the coat peg, retrieved his canvas jacket, and pulled the cream envelope out just enough for her to see the seal remained completely unbroken. "Your father gave me strict instructions, Miss Vance," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a deep, serious register that echoed in the quiet room. "I am only to hand this to you when you are truly ready to face the truth. And right now you are still running back to the very wolves who put you in that ditch." Vivian narrowed her eyes, her anger flaring. "What is that supposed to mean?" Garrett walked to the door, throwing it open to the freezing wind. He pointed a single, steady finger through the fog toward the shattered remains of her Porsche Cayenne across the road. A premium luxury SUV built in Stuttgart doesn't experience a total simultaneous failure of the electronic steering column and the hydraulic brake lines on a perfectly dry road. "Miss Vance," Garrett said coldly, "I took a look at your undercarriage while you were standing on the porch. The main pressurized fluid line didn't crack. It was cleanly severed with a heavy pair of pneumatic cable cutters less than 4 hours ago." Vivian's heart stopped. The world around her seemed to tilt as the freezing air rushed into her lungs. The crash wasn't an accident. Garrett looked down at her, his eyes piercing through her defenses. "Someone didn't want you making it to that board meeting on Monday. Now, do you want to get on that tow truck or do you want to find out who signed your death warrant?" The flatbed driver, a quiet local named Jared Finch, hooked the mangled Porsche to his rig under the rotating amber flashers. Vivian, refusing to be left stranded in the freezing Maine fog, walked alongside Garrett and little Clara toward the only open establishment within miles, the Horizon Diner, located just 2 miles down the road in the sleepy timber town of Ironwood Bay. The diner was warm, smelling of fried onions, old leather, and strong filter coffee. A handful of local loggers and truckers sat at the laminate counters, their conversations dropping to a low hum as Vivian entered. Even in her dust-covered blazer, her striking, high-powered corporate aura screamed, "High Society Boston." She sat at a corner booth, her posture rigidly upright. Garrett sat opposite her, his massive frame easily filling the space, while Clara slid in right next to Vivian, her small hand still clutching her wooden birdhouse. "You're remarkably calm for a man who just told me someone tried to assassinate me," Vivian whispered, her voice tight, vibrating with hidden terror. She kept her eyes locked on Garrett. "Panic doesn't fix a severed brake line, Miss Vance," Garrett replied, his voice low and steady as he poured cream into a mug of black coffee. "And it certainly doesn't stop whoever is coming to check if the job was finished." The bell above the diner's heavy glass door chimed. The ambient warmth of the room seemed to vanish instantly as a tall, sharply dressed man stepped inside. He didn't look like a logger. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, polished Italian leather shoes completely unsuited for the gravel, and carried himself with the slick, dangerous confidence of a corporate predator. It was Ethan Drake, a notorious private security asset frequently retained by Vance Global's ambitious executive vice president Reginald Boyd. Drake's eyes scanned the room, instantly locking onto Vivian. He walked over to the booth, completely ignoring Garrett, and leaned against the wooden privacy partition. "Miss Vance," Drake said, his voice dripping with artificial relief. "We lost track of your vehicle's GPS coordinates 4 hours ago." Mr. Boyd was deeply concerned. "The board is fully assembled in Boston, waiting for your signature on the infrastructure merger. I have a helicopter waiting at a private pad 20 miles south. We need to leave. Now." Vivian felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. She looked at Drake, then remembered Garrett's warning about the severed lines. Drake wasn't here to rescue her. He was here to ensure she was contained. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Ethan. Tell Reginald that the board meeting will be delayed. My car experienced a mechanical issue." Drake's polite smile didn't reach his eyes. His hand moved subtly inside his overcoat, a physical gesture meant to intimidate. "I'm afraid delay isn't an option, Vivian. The shareholders are restless. If you don't board that chopper, Mr. Boyd will be forced to execute the emergency proxy clause, citing your sudden instability." The loggers at the counter turned around, sensing the escalating hostility. The air in the diner grew thick with tension. Vivian's breath hitched. She was entirely cornered, stripped of her corporate security detail, miles from home. Suddenly, Clara reached across the table, her small, warm fingers wrapped tightly around Vivian's trembling hand. The child didn't look at the scary man in the overcoat. She looked directly into Vivian's eyes. "Don't worry," Clara said softly, her voice carrying a profound, innocent certainty that echoed through the quiet diner. "My daddy is here." "Nobody can hurt you when my daddy is standing up." Drake scoffed, finally turning his arrogant gaze toward Garrett, looking down his nose at the faded canvas jacket and the calloused hands. "Local help isn't going to solve your problems, Miss Vance." "Old man, slide out of the booth. This is private corporate business." Garrett didn't slide out. He slowly set his coffee mug down on the laminate table. The porcelain clicked against the surface with absolute finality. He stood up, his 6'3" frame completely towering over the corporate fixer. The quiet, gentle father vanished, replaced by a cold, imposing masculinity that made Drake instinctively take a half-step back. "You're a long way from the corporate office, Mr. Drake," Garrett said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. Drake narrowed his eyes, trying to regain his footing. "You know my name?" "I know your name, I know your service record, and I know you were dishonorably discharged from the 10th Mountain Division at Fort Warren in 2018 for selling structural transport manifests," Garrett said smoothly, his eyes locking onto a small, silver eagle pin fastened to Drake's inner lapel, a detail no ordinary civilian would ever notice. "I also know that if you don't turn around and walk out of this diner in the next 5 seconds, the local sheriff won't be the one handling your extraction." Drake's face went entirely pale. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by genuine shock. He looked at Garrett's hands, noticing for the first time the precise, disciplined posture, the absolute lack of fear, and the rhythmic, tactical breathing of a highly trained predator hiding in plain sight. "Who the hell are you?" Drake whispered, his hand freezing inside his coat. Garrett didn't answer. He simply took one deliberate step forward, crowding Drake's personal space. The sheer kinetic threat radiating from the furniture builder was suffocating. Drake swallowed hard, glanced at the loggers who were now standing up from their bar stools and backed toward the exit. "This isn't over, Vance." Drake spat, slamming the diner door behind him as he retreated into the thick Maine fog. The diner remained dead silent. Vivian looked up at Garrett, her mind spinning wildly. The hidden clues were piling up. A simple carpenter didn't know the dishonorable discharge records of elite corporate fixers. He didn't carry himself like a soldier unless he had commanded them. Garrett sat back down, the dangerous edge evaporating instantly as he looked at his daughter. He gently patted Clara's head, then turned his intense winter sea eyes back to Vivian. "He's going to call Reginald Boyd," Vivian whispered, her hands still shaking despite Clara's warm grip. "They control the whole empire now. I have nothing up here." Garrett reached into his pocket and placed the heavy cream envelope directly on the center of the table between them. "You have this," Garrett said softly. "And you have me. Slide your finger under the seal, Vivian. It's time to find out what your father died protecting." Vivian's fingers rasped against the heavy cream stationery as she slid the letter from the envelope. The diner's low-hanging amber lamps cast a warm glow over her father's distinctive script. "Vivian, if you are reading this, Reginald Boyd has executed his final play. He believes Vance Global is his to dismantle. The infrastructure contracts we secured for the Atlantic Naval Defense Grid are worth billions, but they require a master cryptographic clearance key to activate. I did not leave that key in a bank vault, nor did I leave it with our attorneys. I left it with the only man who ever truly commanded the upper atmosphere, the only man I could trust with my life and your future. Search for the Vanguard ghost. Give him what is left of my heart. Vivian's breath hitched. She stared at the words Vanguard ghost. It was a name spoken in hushed, almost mythical tones within the upper echelons of the Department of Defense and Aerospace Engineering. He was the legendary Black Ops fighter pilot and elite aerospace engineer who had designed the automated stealth guidance systems for the entire United States Navy fleet before vanishing completely from the public eye nearly a decade ago. She slowly raised her eyes from the paper to look at the man sitting across from her. Garrett Sterling was quietly wiping a splash of spilled coffee from his daughter's sleeve with a napkin, his large hand incredibly precise, his face a mask of absolute serenity. "You," Vivian whispered, her voice barely audible over the low murmur of the diner. "The Vanguard ghost. My father wasn't just building shipping yards with you. You engineered the entire foundational software for our maritime grid." Garrett did not deny it. He didn't even look up from his daughter's sleeve. "Your father was a visionary, Vivian, but he surrounded himself with corporate pirates." Before Vivian could ask another question, the overhead fluorescent tubes flickered violently, hummed with a sick static whine, and died completely. The deep, familiar drone of the diner's commercial refrigerators ceased, plunging the entire building into sudden, eerie darkness, broken only by the fading gray twilight bleeding through the fogged windows. Then came the sound. A heavy, rhythmic thumping rattled the glass pane of the diner door. It was the deep, aggressive beat of a multi-million-dollar executive aircraft. A sleek, twin-engine Sikorsky S-76 helicopter, painted in the signature midnight blue and gold livery of Vance Global Enterprises, hovered low over the adjacent muddy clearing, its searchlight cutting a blinding white beam through the thick Maine mist. The heavy glass door of the diner was thrown open, letting in a violent gust of freezing wind that scattered paper menus across the floor. 3 men stepped inside. Leading them was Deputy Marcus Thorne, a local law enforcement official whose uniform badge looked cheap compared to the 2 heavily armed corporate security contractors flanking him in tactical gear. Behind them stood Ethan Drake, his face twisted into a triumphant, cold smirk. The local loggers and truckers at the counter stood up, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor, but the tactical contractors instantly leveled their high-end, suppressed carbines, freezing the locals in place. Deputy Thorne unrolled a heavy, stamped document, walking directly toward the corner booth. He looked at Vivian, completely ignoring her high society stature. "Vivian Vance," Thorne announced loudly, his voice echoing off the laminate walls. "By order of the Middlesex Probate Court and an emergency injunction signed by Executive Vice President Reginald Boyd, you have been formally stripped of all executive authority and declared cognitively incapacitated following a severe, high-speed vehicular accident on the Ridge Road. Your personal and corporate bank accounts have been frozen. Your security clearances are revoked." Vivian stood up, her face burning with sudden, suffocating humiliation. Her powerful CEO aura flared, but her voice trembled under the weight of the betrayal. "This is an illegal coup. I am the majority shareholder of Vance Global. My father built the very infrastructure you are standing on." The tactical security lead, a cold-eyed mercenary named Gideon Hayes, stepped forward, his heavy combat boots crunching on the stray gravel near the booth. He laughed, a low, patronizing sound that cut straight through Vivian's remaining dignity. "Your father is in a mahogany box, lady," Hayes said coldly, looking down at her dust-covered blazer. "And right now, you aren't a CEO. You're just a trespassing hitchhiker with a ruined car, a frozen bank account, and absolutely no authority. You don't even own the dirt under your fingernails anymore. Step out to the chopper before we drag you out in front of these hicks." The public humiliation was total. The powerful, feared Vivian Vance, who had spent her entire adult life commanding hundreds of millions of dollars with a single word, was being reduced to nothing in a small-town diner, stripped of her identity, her wealth, and her safety in front of a room full of strangers. She felt the room spinning. Her breathing became shallow, rapid, her chest heaving as the crushing reality of her absolute helplessness paralyzed her. She couldn't breathe. Her hands shook so violently she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. She was a lioness, completely defanged, panicking internally for the first time in her life. Clara looked up, her little eyes widening in terror as she saw Vivian's distress. The child didn't cry. Instead, she reached out, tugging gently on Garrett's canvas sleeve. "Daddy," Clara whispered, her soft voice cutting through the suffocating tension. "The mean men are making the loud noise again. Make them stop." Garrett Sterling stood up. The shift in the room's gravity was instantaneous. Garrett didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped out of the booth, his massive, imposing frame completely blocking Vivian and Clara from the mercenaries. The quiet, gentle craftsman was gone. In his place stood an unshakable, terrifyingly steady force of pure masculinity. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, heavy silver object, and slid it across the laminate counter toward Deputy Thorne and Gideon Hayes. It was a solid Platinum Commander's Challenge coin, embossed with the Stealth Eagle insignia of the United States Navy's Elite Aerospace Tactical Unit, a restricted token that only 5 men in the entire country possessed. Garrett looked directly into Gideon Hayes' eyes, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm rumble that made the air in the diner freeze. "You just landed a corporate aircraft in a restricted flight corridor without an FAA manifest, Hayes," Garrett said softly. "You are standing on my property, threatening a guest under my roof, and your weapons are unregistered in this district. You have exactly 3 seconds to get that piece of paper out of my face before I show you why they call me the Ghost." Gideon Hayes looked down at the platinum coin and his arrogant smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, paralyzing look of absolute terror. The silence inside the Horizon Diner grew so heavy that the rhythmic drumming of the helicopter blades outside felt distant, like a heartbeat underwater. Gideon Hayes stared down at the platinum coin resting on the scratched laminate counter. His finger hovered just millimeters above the polished eagle insignia, but he didn't dare touch it. The absolute arrogance that had radiated from the mercenaries seconds ago dissolved into a pale, sweating panic. "Hayes?" Ethan Drake demanded, his voice cracking with sudden frustration as he stepped closer. "What are you doing? Serve the papers. We have a private transport window closing in 20 minutes. Hayes didn't look at Drake. He kept his eyes locked on Garrett's unblinking, sea-winter gaze. As a high-tier private contractor, Hayes knew the classified legends of the military-industrial complex. He knew that the man standing before him wasn't just an engineer. He was a phantom who carried a lifetime security clearance signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. To cross him meant disappearing from every government contract list on Earth. "We're leaving," Hayes whispered, his voice completely stripped of its previous malice. He slowly reached down, picked up the legal injunction, and folded it into his tactical vest. "Are you insane?" Deputy Thorne yelled, his hand twitching near his service holster. "I have a court order." "I don't care if you have a mandate from the governor, Marcus," Hayes snapped, backing away toward the door, his eyes never leaving Garrett's massive silhouette. "If we stay in this room for another 60 seconds, we aren't going back to Boston. We're going to a federal holding facility in Virginia. Move out. Now." Drake looked at Vivian, his jaw clenching in absolute fury, but the mercenaries were already retreating through the entrance, pulling the confused deputy with them. The heavy glass door slammed shut, and within moments, the blinding searchlight of the Sikorsky S-76 pivoted away, the roar of the engines rising to a deafening whine as the aircraft lifted into the black, fog-choked sky. Inside the diner, the loggers slowly lowered their defensive posture, looking at Garrett with a mixture of shock and deep, unspoken respect. But before anyone could speak, a violent, unnatural shudder rattled the floorboards beneath their boots. The severe autumn storm that had been brewing over the northern ridges finally broke. A massive atmospheric microburst, a sudden, violent downward draft of freezing mountain air slammed into Ironwood Bay. Outside, the sheer force of the gale caught the rising helicopter, forcing it to tilt dangerously before it cleared the tree line. The massive rotor wash, combined with the 100-mile-per-hour wind, sheared the crown of a century-old white pine towering right behind the diner. A sickening crack echoed through the dark. The heavy timber roof of the diner's rear kitchen collapsed under the weight of the falling tree. Sparks erupted in a brilliant, terrifying shower of blue and orange as the main power transformer on the external pole was ripped from its mountings. A loud, ominous hiss filled the air. The primary propane line feeding the commercial grills had ruptured. Panic erupted instantly. The remaining patrons scrambled toward the front exit, shouting and pushing through the dark. Smoke, thick and bitter with burning grease, began pouring from the kitchen door, filling the diner within seconds. Vivian Vance froze. The high-powered CEO, who could navigate a hostile takeover without a single blink, felt her chest lock tight. Her corporate wealth couldn't fix a collapsing building. Her status couldn't stop the spreading smoke. The absolute lack of control triggered a suffocating wave of panic. Her breathing turned shallow and frantic. She gripped the edge of the table, her legs turning to water as the world spun around her. She had everything the world could offer: money, power, prestige, except the one thing she desperately needed right now: peace. Clara let out a small, frightened cry, the thick smoke making her cough as she clung to Vivian's waist. Garrett didn't yell. He didn't sprint. While the world around them dissolved into chaotic terror, his movements remained steady, deliberate, and perfectly calculated. He stepped into the booth, his massive arms scooping Clara against his chest in a protective embrace. Then, he extended his large, calloused left hand and placed it firmly on Vivian's trembling shoulder. The warmth of his palm cut through the freezing terror paralyzing her body. It was a gesture of pure, unforced safety. "Vivian," Garrett said. His voice wasn't loud, it possessed a grounding, masculine strength that instantly silenced the frantic noise in her head. "Look at me." Vivian forced her eyes up to meet his. Breathing down, Garrett commanded gently, his eyes steady and warm amidst the swirling smoke. "In through the nose, out through the mouth. Follow my stride. I am not letting anything happen to you." Vivian swallowed hard, her trembling hands reaching out to hold onto his canvas sleeve. The sheer contrast between her world of transaction and this man's innate ability to provide absolute security without trying was staggering. She nodded, trusting him completely. Garrett guided her out of the booth, shielding her and Clara with his body as they moved toward the rear loading dock. The front exit was entirely blocked by fallen live wires, spitting blue electricity into the mud. As they reached the back hallway, a heavy oak ceiling beam, weakened by the impact of the pine tree, groaned and collapsed directly across their escape route, blocking the exit door with hundreds of pounds of splintered wood and plaster. Vivian gasped, pulling back as smoke billowed around them. "We're trapped." Garrett didn't hesitate. He set Clara down behind Vivian, stepping toward the burning timber. He didn't use frantic energy. He evaluated the structural leverage points with the eye of an elite engineer. He wedged his heavy leather boot beneath the main fracture point, braced his broad shoulders against the solid frame of the adjacent wall, and gripped the splintering oak with his bare, calloused hands. With a low, powerful grunt, Garrett threw his immense physical strength into the beam. The muscles in his back strained against the canvas of his jacket as he manually lifted the crushing weight, clearing a small triangular opening beneath the wreckage. "Go," Garrett ordered, his face strained but completely controlled. "Slide through. Take Clara." Vivian didn't question him. She grabbed Clara's small hand, dropped to the floor, and scrambled beneath the lifting beam, dragging the child out into the freezing, rain-drenched night air of the back alley. Garrett released the timber with a dull thud, stepping through the opening a second later, completely unscathed. They stood in the downpour, the diner burning behind them, the red glow reflecting in the pooling water. Vivian was soaked, her expensive clothes ruined, shivering violently against the mountain chill. Pauline was already waiting by Garrett's heavy transport van at the edge of the lot, having escaped through the side. Garrett walked over to Vivian, pulled off his heavy canvas jacket, dry and warm on the inside, and draped it gently over her shoulders. He didn't say a word. He just held the lapels together for a second, his steady eyes assuring her that the danger had passed. As they climbed into the safety of the vehicle, Vivian wrapped the oversized jacket tightly around herself, breathing in the scent of cedar, wood, and tobacco. She looked at the quiet craftsman in the driver's seat as he started the engine. The mystery around him was no longer just a curiosity. It was a necessity. She knew that the corporate war in Boston was no longer just about shares and contracts. It was a battle for survival, and the only shield she had left was the man the Pentagon called a ghost. The storm had broken by dawn, leaving the sky over the Apex Executive Terminal at Kennebunk Ridge a brilliant, piercing blue. Inside the panoramic three-story glass lounge overlooking Hangar 4, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Reginald Boyd stood at a polished mahogany podium flanked by microphones from the regional business press and three compromised board members: Julian Kincaid, Beatrice Montgomery, and Silas Croft. Ethan Drake and Deputy Marcus Thorne stood near the back entrance, whispering fiercely to a team of corporate lawyers. They believed the operation in the valley had succeeded. They believed Vivian Vance was either trapped in the ashes of the Horizon Diner or too broken by terror to ever show her face in a courtroom again. It is with a heavy heart, Reginald Boyd announced into the microphones, adjusting his silk tie with a manicured hand, that Vance Global Enterprises must report a tragic turn of events. Our CEO, Vivian Vance, has suffered a severe emotional and physical collapse following a high-speed vehicular accident in the Northern Territory. Under the emergency provisions of our bylaws, I am formally executing the proxy clause to stabilize our infrastructure contracts with the Department of Defense. The journalists scribbled furiously on their tablets. The board members nodded in calculated agreement, ready to sign away the multi-billion-dollar Atlantic naval defense grid to a private offshore consortium. Then, the heavy biometric glass doors at the rear of the terminal slid open with a sharp, pneumatic hiss. The ambient noise in the lounge died instantly. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of executives and reporters as every camera pivoted toward the entrance. Vivian Vance walked into the room. She was spectacular. She had shed the powder-dusted blazer for a sharp, tailored ivory suit that radiated absolute power. Her spine was perfectly straight, her jaw locked with an unyielding, fierce authority that made the senior executives in the front row instinctively shrink back. The panic and vulnerability that had paralyzed her in the smoke of the diner were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fire. But it was the man walking beside her that caused the entire room to freeze. Garrett Sterling had traded his faded canvas jacket and work boots for a flawless midnight black bespoke suit that accentuated his massive, disciplined frame. His silver and blue Commander's Challenge coin was pinned neatly to his lapel. He walked with the slow, terrifyingly measured stride of a man who commanded the ground he walked on. Clara walked between them, her small fingers tucked securely inside Garrett's massive left hand. She looked at the flashing cameras and the crowd of expensive suits without a single trace of fear, because her father was holding her. Reginald Boyd choked on his breath, his face instantly draining of color until he looked like a corpse under the fluorescent lights. The glass of water in his hand trembled violently, spilling over the mahogany podium. "Vivian," Boyd stammered, his smooth corporate voice cracking completely. You aren't authorized to be here. This is a closed executive session." "Security, remove these trespassers." Ethan Drake and Gideon Hayes stepped forward from the perimeter, their hands moving instinctively toward their waistbands. But before they could take 2 steps, the side doors of the terminal burst open. 6 heavily armed federal marshals, accompanied by a detachment of naval security forces in crisp dress uniforms, flooded the lounge. They did not move to assist Boyd. Instead, they instantly surrounded Drake, Hayes, and Deputy Thorne, pinning them against the glass walls. Walking behind the federal detail was a man whose face was recognizable to every defense contractor in the world. Secretary Wallace Sinclair of the Department of Defense. Sinclair didn't even glance at Reginald Boyd or the trembling board members. He walked straight past the podium, stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Garrett Sterling, and brought his hand up to his brow in a crisp, flawless military salute. "Commander Sterling," Secretary Sinclair said, his voice echoing off the glass walls with absolute authority, "the Pentagon received your encrypted data transmission at 0400 hours. It is an honor to see you back in the field, sir." The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding, chaotic frenzy. The reporters began shouting over one another, the realization hitting the room like a physical blow. The quiet, hidden carpenter from the logging valley wasn't just a local bystander. He was the Vanguard Ghost, the legendary Black Ops commander and aerospace genius who had single-handedly engineered the national defense software they were trying to steal. Julian Kincaid stumbled backward, his chair toppling over with a loud crash against the hardwood floor. Beatrice Montgomery covered her mouth in absolute horror. The power reversal was total, public, and devastating. Garrett slowly released Claire's hand, letting her step back toward Pauline, who had entered quietly behind them. He stepped up to the podium, his massive frame completely crowding Reginald Boyd out of the frame. He looked down at the pale, sweating executive with eyes that carried the freezing weight of a winter ocean. "The emergency proxy you are holding is invalid, Mr. Boyd," Garrett said, his low, resonant rumble silencing the shouting reporters instantly. "The cryptographic clearance keys for the Atlantic Naval Defense Grid were never part of the probate estate. They require a dual biometric signature from the primary shareholder, Vivian Vance, and the lead system architect." Garrett reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a sleek, modern titanium drive, and slotted it directly into the terminal's main media console. And as the lead architect, Garrett whispered, his voice cutting through the silent room like a blade, "I am officially revoking your clearance, along with your freedom." The massive digital display walls behind the podium flickered, instantly replacing the corporate logistics slides with a scrolling, unredacted log of internal emails, wire transfers to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and the original, untampered engineering reports from the vehicle inspection that proved Boyd had ordered the hit on Vivian's life. Reginald Boyd sank to his knees behind the podium, his hands covering his face as the absolute reality of his destruction played out on national television. Vivian Vance stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Garrett. She looked down at the man who had tried to take her life, her voice cold and absolute. "Take them away." As the federal marshals dragged Boyd and his fixers out in handcuffs, the crowd broke into a stunned, deafening applause. But amidst the chaos, Vivian looked up at Garrett, noticing a subtle, dark shadow crossing his expression as his eyes locked onto a tracking radar screen at the edge of the console. A single, unidentified red indicator was flashing over the northern corridor. The media frenzy outside the glass walls of the Apex executive terminal sounded like a distant ocean storm, entirely muted by the heavy acoustic reinforcement of the VIP lounge. Naval security personnel moved efficiently, clearing the remaining shell-shocked board members and guiding the frantic reporters down the escalators. Inside the quiet room, the large digital terminal wall hummed softly. The single, flashing red indicator that had caught Garrett's attention began to pulse slower. Garrett's large fingers moved across the interface with absolute familiarity, bypassing 3 layers of military-grade encryption without looking at the keypad. He tapped a final command sequence, and the blinking anomaly turned a solid, steady blue. "The perimeter drone network has returned to standby," Garrett said, his voice dropping back into its familiar, grounding rumble. He turned away from the console, looking at Secretary Sinclair. "The Atlantic naval grid is secure, Wallace. The unauthorized backdoors Reginald Boyd attempted to install have been permanently purged from the system." Secretary Sinclair sighed, a massive weight visibly lifting from his shoulders. He reached out, offering a firm, respectful handshake to the giant in the black suit. "You built a flawless shield, Commander. The Department of Defense owes you a debt we can never properly repay. If you ever decide to leave the Timber Valley, there is a director's chair in Washington with your name on it." "I've already found my chair, Wallace," Garrett replied softly, his eyes drifting for a fraction of a second toward the window where the morning light hit the distant pine ridges. "And I prefer to sand it myself." Sinclair gave a knowing, deeply respectful nod, saluted one final time, and led his naval escort out of the lounge, leaving the heavy glass doors to slide shut with a quiet click. The sudden silence in the massive room was heavy, almost physical. Vivian Vance stood near the panoramic glass overlooking the tarmac, her arms crossed over the front of her tailored ivory suit. The high-powered, untouchable CEO who had commanded thousands of employees was completely still. The adrenaline that had carried her through the public execution of Reginald Boyd's corporate coup was finally fading, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. She looked out at the private jets glinting in the sun, realizing that for the first time in her life, the massive empire beneath her feet didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a responsibility she was finally free to handle on her own terms. Garrett walked over to her, his heavy steps making no sound on the thick plush carpet. He stopped 2 feet away, standing beside her in the quiet light. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a hollow corporate platitude. He simply stood there, an unshakable, protective barrier between her and the rest of the world. Vivian looked down at his hands, noticing the slight trace of a faint, pale scar running across his knuckle, a reminder of the heavy timber beam he had manually lifted to save her from the burning diner just hours prior. "You didn't have to do any of this," Vivian whispered, her voice cracking slightly, revealing the raw, emotional vulnerability she had kept hidden from the world for a decade. "You could have stayed in Weymouth Hollow. You could have left me to the wolves. Why did you risk everything for a woman who crashed into your truck and demanded your compliance?" Garrett looked out at the runway, his profile etched in the sharp morning sun. "Your father didn't just come to me because I engineered the grid software. Vivian," Garrett said softly, 20 years ago, during a classified extraction operation in the Persian Gulf, my transport helicopter took heavy anti-aircraft fire over the coastal waters. We went down in a restricted zone. The military infrastructure couldn't reach us in time. It was a commercial salvage crane vessel owned by Arthur Vance that broke through the blockade and pulled my remaining men out of the water. Vivian's breath hitched. She turned her head quickly to look at him. My father never told me that. Arthur didn't build an empire just to count his billions, Garrett said, turning his Wintersea eyes to meet hers. He built it because he believed in protecting people who stood in the gap. When he sat in my workshop last year, he told me that his greatest regret wasn't the corporate battles he lost. It was that he had spent so much time shielding you from the ugly truths of the world that you hadn't learned how to see the monsters hiding in your own boardroom. He asked me to wait until the structure fractured. He knew you would find your way to the valley. He knew you had his blood in your veins. The heavy doors clicked open again, and Clara padded into the lounge, her small sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. She was still holding the handmade wooden birdhouse against her chest. She stopped right beside Vivian, looking up at the high-powered executive with wide, completely untroubled eyes. Sloane, Clara said softly, using the name she had settled on back at the valley. Look, the birdhouse didn't get broken in the loud fire. Vivian dropped to her knees, right there on the terminal floor, completely unbothered by the pristine ivory fabric of her trousers touching the dust. She reached out, her hands surprisingly steady now, and gently placed her fingertips against the rough cedar wood of the little birdhouse. It's beautiful, Clara, Vivian murmured, her voice thick with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel since her father's funeral. It's the strongest house I've ever seen. Clara smiled, a pure, radiant expression that seemed to shatter the remaining coldness in the corporate room. The child reached out her small, warm arm and wrapped it around Vivian's neck, leaning her head against her shoulder in a gesture of absolute, unconditioned trust. Vivian closed her eyes, burying her face into the little girl's dark curls. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. All the money, the skyscraper towers, and the global logistics contracts in the world couldn't buy the absolute safety and warmth radiating from this single child and her father. Garrett watched them from above, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. He reached down, his large, calloused hand gently resting on the crown of Clara's head, his thumb lightly brushing against the fabric of Vivian's shoulder. The contact was brief, a silent promise of solidarity that required no contract, no signature, and no negotiation. The transport van is packed, Garrett said quietly. We should leave before the afternoon fog rolls back into the valley. Vivian stood up, smoothing her suit, her eyes locked onto his. I'm not going back to Boston, Garrett. Not yet. There is one last thing my father left behind in that envelope, and it isn't a cryptographic key. She reached into the inner pocket of her ivory jacket and pulled out a smaller, secondary slip of paper that had been tucked behind the main letter, a property deed bearing a legal description that made Garrett's jaw tighten. Garrett took the folded parchment from Vivian's hand. His eyes scanned the legal description, the county plot coordinates, and the heavy embossed gold emblem of the mainland registry. A rare look of profound astonishment passed over his rugged features, his jaw tightening as he read the name of the grantor, Arthur Vance. The entire ridge, Garrett said, his voice dropping into a low whisper. He bought the 300 acres surrounding my timber yard, every square inch of the valley floor. He bought it through a blind legacy trust 9 years ago, Vivian said, looking out at the sprawling pine canopy stretching toward the horizon. The day after your military retirement became official. He knew the corporate board would eventually try to expand our logistics footprint into this valley. He bought the land to ensure that no matter what happened to Vance Global, no one could ever force you or Clara out of this sanctuary. He left it to me, but the final clause requires me to sign it over to you. It was his way of maintaining the perimeter. A faint, emotional smile touched Vivian's lips, the cold, defensive shell she had worn for years finally dissolving in the clean morning air. I spent my entire life thinking my father only understood balance sheets and shipping volume, she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't realize he was spending his final years trying to build a fortress of quiet for the people he cared about. I'm not going back to the Boston headquarters, Garrett. Yesterday, before the board meeting, I drafted an executive decree. I have transferred full operational control of Vance Global to an independent, publicly audited trust managed by an outside board in Chicago. Garrett looked at her, his sea winter eyes searching her face. And what happens to Vivian Vance? I am retaining exactly one asset, she said, stepping closer to him, her posture relaxed, her hands finally completely still. The Arthur Vance Community Reclamation Fund. I am personally overseeing the reconstruction of the Ironwood Bay district. We are rebuilding the Horizon Diner, putting a new transformer on the ridge, and clearing the old shipyard. I think I've spent enough time around the wolves. I'd like to see what it's like to build something that doesn't require a security detail. Garrett didn't answer right away. He folded the property deed, slid it into his pocket, and looked down at her with a quiet, masculine admiration that made the breath catch in her throat. He didn't offer a hollow corporate contract. He simply extended his large, calloused hand. "The valley is a quiet place, Vivian," he said softly. "But the winters are long. You'll need a better pair of boots." She took his hand, her slender fingers fitting perfectly against his rough palm. "I think I can manage." 6 months later, the late spring sun thawed the northern Maine wilderness, turning the valley into a vibrant, deep emerald green. The scent of damp earth, blooming wild lupine, and fresh cedar filled the morning air. At the edge of the clearing, right beside the original timber barn, the frame of a massive new structure rose toward the sky. It was a beautiful, two-story workshop featuring a soaring cathedral ceiling and a sweeping wall of industrial glass windows designed to capture the shifting northern light. The heavy structural timbers had been manually notched and raised, smelling heavily of fresh pine and wood oil. A freshly restored, vintage midnight blue Chevrolet pickup truck sat parked under the shade of a massive maple tree, its steel bodywork immaculate, reflecting the clear blue sky. Clara sat cross-legged on a clean canvas drop cloth near the entrance of the new workshop, a smudge of bright blue paint across her cheek. She was carefully applying a coat of weatherproof sealant to the side of a brand new handmade wooden sign. Painted on the wood in neat, proud letters were the words, "Sterling and Vance Fine Timber Works." Vivian stepped out from the interior of the framed building, wearing a pair of faded denim jeans, a pair of worn leather work boots, and one of Garrett's oversized red flannel shirts with the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She carried a tray with 2 mugs of steaming porcelain tea. The sharp, untouchable corporate billionaire had completely transformed. Her face was sun-kissed, her eyes bright, and her movements filled with a deep, unbothered peace she had never known in the high society towers of Boston. Garrett descended the heavy timber ladder from the second-floor loft, his broad shoulders glistening with a light sheen of sweat, his dark hair dusted with fine cedar shavings. He set his framing hammer down on a workbench and walked over to her, his gaze locked onto her with an unshakable warmth. He took a mug from the tray, his knuckles brushing against her fingers. The touch was simple, familiar, and packed with the weight of a shared future. Clara looked up from her painting, her wide brown eyes dancing with mischief as she looked at the two of them standing closely together in the warm sunlight. "Sloane?" Clara called out, using the name that had now become their shared bond. "Are you going to help Daddy finish the main doors this afternoon, or are you just going to stare at him until the sun goes down?" Vivian flushed slightly, a genuine, hearty laugh escaping her throat, a sound that would have shocked anyone who knew her in her previous life. She walked over to the drop cloth, kneeling down beside the little girl, and gently nudged her shoulder. "I am going to help him paint the trim, Clara," Vivian said softly, her voice filled with an immense protective affection as she reached out to wipe the blue smudge from the child's cheek. "And then I'm going to stay right here." Clara looked up, her expression turning serious for a brief second. "Forever?" Vivian looked up at the ladder where Garrett stood, his massive frame framed against the brilliant blue sky, his steady, protective presence, offering a lifetime of absolute security without ever having to say a single word. He gave her a slow, decisive nod, his eyes telling her everything she ever needed to know about safety, loyalty, and redemption. Vivian turned back to the child, her heart completely full. "Yes, Clara, forever." In the fading amber light of the Maine afternoon, the three of them worked side by side, their shadows stretching long across the fresh cedar floorboards. The noise of the corporate world, the betrayal of the boardroom, and the ghosts of the past had entirely vanished, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of a craftsman's tools and the quiet promise of a love that had finally found its home in the valley.